Hello, everybody. My name's Vic, and I'm an alcoholic. You know, actually, it was a moped I was on. It wasn't a tricycle. Might have looked like there was me on it, but fortunately, I don't think there's any pictures of a 300-pound man on a moped, at least not me. But that's okay. I heard a guy that had got out of the unit that I was visiting at that time described me coming up in his story one night, and made an impression on me because he asked me. I rode up in the rain. He asked why I came, and another member of our group had drove up in his pickup truck. He said, "Why'd you call me?" And I said, "I didn't know you were coming." I said, "They told me to go to any length to get this program." And that's what I'm willing to do. That's why when Tom called me today, I said, "I'll come." I didn't steal his shirt. Actually, I went to the supply house a couple of weeks ago, and I said, "I hear you've been giving some of my people that have been stopped by here free stuff." And they said, "Yeah, we've been giving some T-shirts. We think we even got one to fit you." And I don't generally take stuff, but they actually had a pair of pliers I wanted that cost a lot more than a T-shirt, so I did take a pair of those pliers. And but today I went over and I said, "Look, I need to go somewhere tonight, and I don't have any clean clothes with me, and I got to leave after work and go straight there." And I said, "If you got that 3X T-shirt, I will take it." So they had one, and I took it. And I do have my sweaty one out there in the truck. But anyway, tell you a few things about myself to qualify myself here, and what my sponsor told me that, and it was real strange. Let me tell you my sobriety date and all, because my sponsor told me I better tell these things up front or I'm liable to forget them. My sobriety date is February the 1st, 1994. Picked up one white chip. It's worked so far because I do what I'm supposed to do. Well, it's what the people have told me in this program, what the book tells me, what my sponsor tells me to do, and what a loving and gracious God tells me to do. And it's worked. I have a sponsor, and I sponsor other men. I have a home group. I've always had the same home group. And I do a lot of service work, as Tom alluded to, not only in corrections, but I'm a DCM from my district. I've been a GSR. I do service work in my home group. I've done just about every position in there. That never let me be the treasurer. I don't understand that, but they have the reasons, I'm sure, but that's okay. But anyway, today, when Tom called, it was around lunchtime, and I was standing in this job trailer. I was talking to a job superintendent on this job that I have on Fort Bragg, and the phone started ringing. Now, I don't normally have my personal cell phone on me at work. I have my company cell phone, and this phone was ringing, and these pants have this little pocket in the side, and I had stuck my personal cell phone down in there this morning when I left home. And I said, I got a cell phone that's got a ringtone like that. And didn't even dawn on me that it was mine. And then the voicemail thing went off, and I said, "Well, that sounds like I got one like that too." And you see, I have a disease of perception. What you say and what I hear, or what just don't necessarily go through one ear and stick in this brain and come out the other ear. It may not even come close to what you really said. And I've discovered that after many trial and error problems that I've had over the year. I had a real problem with what policemen said to me, which is why I probably didn't have those driver's licenses for so long. But I had a problem. I've had a problem with authority, whether it be my parents or the law or people that I work for or anybody else throughout my life. But I'm going to get started pretty much try to tell you about my story the best I can. And I don't know exactly what I'll tell you tonight. There will be some things I will tell you that I know I talk about every time I tell my story. The message I will deliver to you, I have no idea. Because earlier today when Tom called me, and a couple of times since then, I've asked the higher power, whom I call God today, to let his message be delivered, not mine. Because my message is not one you want to hear. His is. I don't remember a lot about my childhood, and I heard something since I've been in the program, and actually I heard it very recently. I heard a speaker say the reason I don't remember a whole lot about my past is because the only thing I ever thought about was me. That makes a lot of sense to me. Because I was so self-centered, and the only thing I ever thought about me, I don't know anything about anybody else around me. I don't know events. I don't know what happened to other people. I know things that affected me. So I remember a few things about my childhood while I'm growing up. And I remember some good times. I remember some bad times. But there's a whole lot of blank spots in there. My father came here from Denmark right after the Second World War. He met my mother, who was from South Carolina, and met her up in Maryland, where I was born. We moved down to South Carolina when I was about 3 years old. And we moved around to different states in the South, Southeast. He followed large construction projects, and we moved around quite a bit. And, I would get somewhere and I would meet people, and by the time I got friends with them, it would be time to move. And so I grew up not having a lot of friends. I had some relatives that we always based out of Greenville, South Carolina, so I had some relatives that when we came back there, I would be, have friends that were relatives. But as far as having friends that I grew up with, I don't have any of those. But I have a whole lot of friends in my head. I don't know if they're my friends or not, but they're there. They still talk to me today. I just don't listen to them quite as much. But we still have conversations real early in the morning sometimes when I drive to work. But anyway, we moved to North Carolina in 1959, and my mother was extremely unhappy in the state of North Carolina. I don't know why she was unhappy. I didn't know at that time. I do know now, I guess. And then 1960, on April the 1st, 1960, my mother committed suicide. That was had a lot of effect on me. It had a lot of effect on my family. And no one in my family ever talked about it. My father never took us aside as children and said, this is why your mother did this and all. It just was like pushed aside under the rug, and nobody ever talked about it. I had a lot of, and I was not raised in a church. I went to church a few times, and the church I went to was a Southern Baptist church. What I heard was a message of if you did wrong, you'd be punished for it. And of course, what I took that to mean was that, and I knew I did wrong because I know I disobeyed my mother, and my father worked out of town a lot of times when we weren't on big jobs. If he was gone out of town or something, I wouldn't do what she said. And so I had some feelings, some emotions that I didn't know how to deal with. I had emotions. I felt guilty. I felt like that if I'd have been a better son, she wouldn't have done it. I felt that she didn't love me, that if she had loved me, she wouldn't have done it. I felt like that God was punishing me because I wasn't a good son. So I've carried a lot of emotions around me for a long, long time until I got into this program. Actually, was I able to deal with those emotions. And so I buried all that deep inside of me. And for several years, it was just buried deep inside of me, and the emotions kept building up. I was introduced to alcohol at a very early age, but I never drank enough at an early age. I never had the chance to drink enough to do anything for me. I was 16 when I got drunk the first time, and I remember a little bit about that incident. So I remember somewhere in my childhood watching a movie or something. If you got invited to a party and you were a good guest, you always carried the host a gift for inviting you to the party. And I had never been invited to a party before. So I got invited to a Halloween party, and I asked somebody what could I carry, and they said, well, you could carry 151 rum as a gift. So I went to an ABC store at 16 years old, walked in and bought 2/5 of Bacardi 151 rum, and I went to this party, and I gave one to the girl that had invited me to the party. And me and this guy that had told me to get the 151 rum were going to drink the other one. He disappeared somewhere during the night, very early. And what I remember about that night was that they came in. I was sitting in a room in the dark on the couch by myself, and I was drinking straight out of the bottle. And they said, "You've had enough. give us the bottle, and I told them I'd already gave them their bottle, and that one was mine. And I remember her coming back in that room sometime later and saying that everybody had to leave, that her parents were coming back. They had been to a party somewhere, and they were coming back home. I remember trying to crawl through the front door to go get in my car to drive home. And what I remember about that was they were trying to close the door on me to keep me from leaving. And somebody carried me home, and I woke up the next day in my bed, and I never found all the clothes that I wore to that party. And nobody ever told me what happened to those clothes, so I had fantasies about what happened to those clothes. I still don't know to this day, and I'll be 65 years old in a couple of weeks, and I still don't know to this day what happened to those clothes. But I had a lot of thoughts about what might happen to those clothes. But anyway, so that was my first real adventure with alcohol, and I woke up on Sunday morning and I was sick as a dog. My head was splitting open, and I thought, man, I'm never doing this again. And so the next weekend I drank beer because it seemed like a better idea. And I had a job, and so I was able to afford to buy beer. And so I did. And as long as I worked, I could buy beer. And I don't know why it was, but if I ever went, anywhere I ever went, I could go in an ABC store, I could go into a convenience store, I could go into a pool room or a bar, and I could always buy alcohol, unless I took somebody else with me. And back then, you had to have a draft card. And of course, I didn't have a draft card because I wasn't old enough to have a draft card. So if I carried anybody else with me, they would always ask to see my draft card. And of course, I didn't have one, so they wouldn't sell to me. So what I did is I just didn't want to carry anybody with me, and I would go in and buy, and then I would carry it out, and we would ride around and drink. And well, one day I went to work early. I always went to work early, and the guy said I had to do something, and I told him I wasn't even on the clock, and he kept telling me I had to do this. I had to do it. I said I don't go to work at 4 o'clock. It was like 20 minutes to 4. And I said, I'm just here to help you out a little bit, and I don't get on the clock at 4 o'clock. And he kept on, and so I said, well, I quit. And so I went and changed back into my street clothes, and another friend came in. He had just dressed out in his uniform. He said, where are you going? I said, well, I just quit. And he said, wait a minute, I'll go with you. So we left that guy there by himself, and we thought, well, we taught him a lesson, but what it taught me was I didn't have any money. And so that didn't work too good, but see, I met some guys that we knew some people that we thought they were juvenile delinquents. Now, see, this is where perception plays in again, because I really don't know what I thought I was. I'd already been caught drinking in public, and back then you had to have a church key to open beer, and the police had already made us open our beer and pour it out in the parking lot, and throw the church key away and stuff like that. And I'd already been to juvenile court and stuff like that, so I don't really know what I thought I was, but I didn't consider myself a juvenile delinquent, but that's what I thought these guys were. And so they said, we know where you can get all the beer you can tote. Now, to a 16-year-old guy, that sounded like a really good deal. But it wasn't such a good deal after all, but we went and did that. We broke into this little place, and for about 2 years, that's what I did on a regular basis. And I eventually got caught, and I went to prison, and I pulled 51 weeks on a 200 what could have been a 240-year sentence. I wound up pulling 51 weeks on it, but got very lucky and got released real early on a Youthful Offender Act, and so I went to work, and I had a chance to drink right after I got out of prison, and I didn't do it because I was afraid to go back to prison. To be honest with you, I wasn't afraid. I was afraid to drink because if I drank, I'd go back to prison. But that didn't last very long either, and so I started drinking again. There's some other outside issues in my story. They're in there, but that's it. I'm not going to talk about them or dwell on them, but they are part of who I am, and they got me here. At some stage, they played a part in it anyway. But that was in the late 60s and early 70s. I worked for a company. They promoted me a lot, and I went out of state working for them. And my drinking all during their 70s increased and increased and increased. But I was running with people that were doing the same thing I was doing. Everything seemed normal to me. I joined an outlaw motorcycle club in the 70s and ran with them for a few years, and everything seemed, I was doing what seemed normal to me. Came back to, I moved out of state, came back to North Carolina in the later 70s, and in 1980 I met my lady that's my wife now. I had got married in the earlier 70s and got divorced, but in 1980 I met my present wife, and we hit it off pretty good, and when I met Joanne, she had 2 sons, and Patrick and Andy. And I fell in love with them 2 boys just as much as I did with her. And 1980, I found out my father had cancer. And I was mad again. And my father, at this time, somewhere in this time period, actually told me about my mother, about her suicide, and the reasons that she did it, and things like that. I found out it wasn't the first time she tried to commit suicide. It was the successful time she had done it. He told me the circumstances of it. I knew that she had hanged herself, but I didn't know she had hanged herself in a jail cell. I didn't know she had hanged herself after getting a DUI and getting locked up. And I didn't know it was 45 minutes after she got locked up that she hanged herself, and that she could have probably, from his telling me about her in my younger life, and him telling me about his experiences with her and all, that she would have probably qualified as a member of this program, and probably as a sister program to this also. But I didn't learn that until I was a grown man, and by that time I was well on my way myself, and of course that didn't slow me down a bit. I had never heard of alcoholism. I had never heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't have a clue about it. Didn't think I would ever be anything like that. My perception of an alcoholic at this stage of my life was somebody that slept under the bridges and drank wine out of a paper bag, and had no idea that I would ever go there. But anyway, my father wound up passing away within a year, and Joanne had a business. Back in those days, those businesses were called head shops, and I actually wound up buying into her businesses, and the party was on then, because there was a lot of cash money, and a lot of things happened during that time. But in 1982, we found out that Andy, her youngest son, had leukemia, and he died 15 months later, and I had a lot of resentments going on in my life, resentments against God at this time, and the only thing I wanted to feel was oblivion. And I did whatever I could get my hands on, whether it be alcohol or any other substance that I could get my hands on. I wanted to feel nothing. Numb is all I wanted to feel. And at this time in my life, for several years, I stayed up 6 and 7 days a week. And the only time that I ever went down was when I fell. And I would literally, I passed out behind counters, taking money out of customers' hands, hit the floor and bounce right back up, and keep going, and just keep going, and keep going, and keep going, until I physically could go no further. I built myself an alarm clock one time. I'm an electrician by trade. I built myself an alarm clock out of an 8-inch fire bell. When I passed out that night, it was 18 inches from my head. It went off the next morning. It rang for 2 hours. My wife came down from upstairs and shut it off. I never heard it. And so I lived for all through the 80s, from around 80, probably from around the 83, or I got sober enough in 84 that Joanne and I got married. But from then on, up to the early 90s, that's how I lived my life. Whenever I got enough money, I went and did what it took, whatever, just so I just felt nothing. And after a while, Joanne just said that she couldn't be around me or anything else. Our older son Patrick, who I had adopted, he left. He moved to Wadesboro, where I live now, to be with his grandmother, to get away from the craziness that was in our lives. Joanne walked away from the businesses basically, and said, I can't be here anymore. And so I made another brilliant decision which was to stop paying taxes. I don't recommend that. If you've ever started paying taxes, it's real hard to stop. And if you're still in business at the same location, especially. And, they would come by and they would say, if you do stop paying, fill out the papers. They get more upset because you don't fill out the papers than they do if you don't pay the money. I'll tell you, it's the truth. I lost my driver's license in 1985. Didn't slow me down a bit. I continued to drive because at this time I also decided that I was above the law. Law was written for people that obeyed them. It wasn't meant for me because I didn't obey them. So I did what I pleased. The fact that I didn't have a driver's license never stopped me from driving. The only time it stopped me from driving was when they locked me up for it. And when I got out, I drove away. I used to drive to court to go for no driving. If I had to drive my permanently revoked license, and I would drive to court to go to court for that ticket. I would go to court with 15 tickets at a time. And it just never dawned on me that if I actually quit driving, I might actually get my driver's license back. And I think if it had dawned on me, it wouldn't have made any difference at that stage of my life. But in 1991, there came a knock on the door. Now, the sheriff had been to this business for over the years, probably 25 or 30 times, knocking on the door, telling me that I had 15 minutes to get out until the rent was paid. And I would go and borrow money from somebody and go pay the rent and get back in again. And by this time, the only people in the business was me, and I had a 175-pound Great Dane. We occupied the building, and there came a knock in 1991, and if you've ever heard that knock, you know what it sounds like. And I just hollered, "Go away! I don't open up to 10 o'clock," and they said, "Open up, or we're going to take the door." And so I knew who they were. So I got up and opened the door, and they said, "You got 15 minutes to get out." And I said, "Well, how much do I owe?" And they said, "No, this is the state. We're closing the business." So they closed it for lack of failure to pay taxes. So in 1991, I went back to prison. And these are all white-collar crimes. And so I had 3 2-year sentences at that time, and I went back and I pulled 9 days. And I thought that was a pretty good deal because I owed $7,000 to the state after they sold all the business stuff, and all I owed them $7,000 left. And when I went to prison and I was in there 9 days and I came out, they didn't owe me anything. I thought that was a heck of a deal. And but it was all misdemeanor stuff, so it didn't really matter. And I owed the federal government $52,000, I think it was, and they had a $38,000 lien on my house. And so I talked to my lawyer to see if he could make a deal and I could serve a few months and satisfy the feds, but they wouldn't buy that. So in 1991, I came to Wadesboro, where I said I would never be. And that's where I spent 3 years in the worst alcoholism I've ever lived in my life. The 80s were terrible. They were awful. But the last 3 years of my alcoholism was the most degrading. And when I lived in Durham, I wound up sleeping by the railroad tracks, and I slept under bridges, and I drank wine out of the paper bag, and I did all that stuff. I lived in homeless shelters and ate out of soup kitchens and sold my blood, and I did all that stuff to keep drinking. But when I got to Wadesboro and I moved in with my mother-in-law, my alcoholism there was the worst. I actually got a job when I got to Wadesboro, and there was a bar halfway. Now, there's not a lot of bars. Wadesboro's not a very big town, and there's not a lot of bars there. There was one bar at a little place called Ambets between where I lived and where I worked. And the guy would come by and pick me up in the mornings and take me to work. And on the afternoons, I'd say, "You don't have to take me home, just drop me at the bar." And I got to know the bartender real well. And he let me run a tab. And so every week I ran a tab. And then on Thursdays when I got paid, the bank was right across the street from the bar, so I would say drop me at the bank, and he would drop me at the bank, and I would go to the bank and cash my check and go pay my tab so I could drink another week. My mother-in-law took me in. She fed me, she clothed me, she gave me a place to stay. And every night I went in drunk. And I slammed and bammed, fell over furniture. She would come up there and she'd say, "Son, are you okay?" And she'd stayed in another part of the house where we stayed. She would get out of her bedroom and come up every night and ask me, "Was I okay? Was I hurt?" or whatever. And I would curse at her every night, tell her to get out of my bedroom. And she would look at me just as calm as she could be. And she'd say, "Son, this is my house. If there's any getting out, it's going to be you." She'd turn around and go back to her bedroom. Next day I'd get up and I'd say, "Charlie Bell will never happen again." And I did that for 3 years. I continued to drive. When I got something to drive, I bought a Ford pickup truck, brown on brown. I got a DUI in it. My wife got one or two in it. My son got one in it. Rough truck. Sold it to my neighbor across the street. He got one. Come back over and said, "Bitch, you ever had any problems with this truck?" I said, "Yeah, baby." I said, "Yeah, I think everybody in my family got at least one DUI in it." He painted it blue and got a DUI in it. Bad truck. But I got another DUI in another vehicle, and none of that slowed me down. I mean, nothing stopped me, because the first DUI I got that truck, I was at the AMVETS. When I left AMVETS, I had my wife and my son with me. There were 5 police cars sitting outside AMVETS. And I left AMVETS, drove home, let them out, and they said, "Aren't you coming in?" I said, "No, I'm going back to the club." There's 5 police cars sitting there. I go back to the club. Guess who they stopped going to the club? So, but 1993, I was driving while permanently revoked. Of course, I wasn't drinking. I was going to work. I was driving my truck, and a highway patrolman stopped me. It was real weird, because I was driving. I had left one of the job sites and I was going to another one. And the highway patrolman, I saw a car sitting over. It was unmarked, and I said, "The car looks strange, sitting over there at that gas station." And I went on down and did what I needed to do, and I was coming back, and I said, "Darn, that car's still sitting there." And of course, as soon as I passed him, he threw the blues on and come got me. He walked up to me and he just looked at me and shook his head, and he said, "When are you ever going to learn?" He said, "It doesn't matter what you drive, it's you." That's the first time that ever dawned on me. The very first time I ever had a thought like that pass through my head. It didn't matter, because it didn't matter what kind of vehicle I was in. I've been in all kinds of vehicles and got caught. I only got caught once on a motorcycle, and that's because there was a chain link fence on the side of the road. But every vehicle, and I drove a lot of different vehicles, and I got stopped in every one of them. It never dawned on me it wasn't the vehicle, it's me. It's my behavior that gets me in trouble. It's not the car I'm at, it's not the place I'm at, it's me. I never thought about that. That got me to thinking. That didn't get me to doing anything but thinking. But it got me to buying that moped. It really did. Because when I went before that judge, that time, and I'd already been for the DUIs, I'd already been sentenced to this mental health deal. And I had a lawyer when I went up there for this judge. That judge looked at me and he said, if you come back in my courtroom one more time, I've got a place for you. Well, I done been to that place, and I knew exactly where he was talking about. I go to that place on a regular basis now, but I get to hear that door shut on the way out now. I didn't want to hear that door shut and me not be able to get back out of it. So I knew what he was talking about, and that got me to thinking too. Now, it didn't get me to go to that mental health program. The only thing that got me to go to the mental health program was the fact that I only had 1 year to do that mental health program. And my time was running out. Because I didn't, and when I went to that, the man said, I want you to go to 10 Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and get the signature. Okay. And I said, okay, that works for me. And the guy that bought that truck from me, lived right across the street from me, said, I know where, I had never heard of Alcoholics Anonymous at this stage of my life. He said, I know where it's at. I'll take you to it. He'd been in and out of the program. He said, I know where it's at, and I'll take you to it. And he said, they have a speaker meeting on Monday night, which we do in my home group. And I said, cool. One night we get to signature. Can't be too bad. I'm going to this mental health thing 10 nights. We go 10 Monday nights. We get 10 signatures. It's over. So I went there on Monday night. This girl yammed on and on and on. Couldn't tell you a thing she said. Guy came up to after the meeting, but I'd been out there drinking with him. I'd been there when he got DUI. They tried to get me out, and I said, you ain't getting me out of this car. But I knew what it was going to do to me if they got me out. They're going to lock me up public drunk. So I sat there in the car. I thought I was going to be slick and drive home. The guy reached over and took the keys out of the car. Left me sitting on the side of the road in that car, too. He was slicker than I was. But anyway, so he come over and tried to give me a hug. I wasn't having none of that either. And he said, what did you think about it? And I told him what I thought about it. He said, I'll pick you up on Tuesday night. We got a discussion meeting. I think you'll like it better. I thought, 2 nights, 2 signatures, this is not too bad. I got a king alcoholic mind. I ain't found it yet, but it's there somewhere. In 3 weeks, I had 12 signatures. This guy hauled me all over the place. Took me to a prison meeting. Wasn't supposed to, but he did. Took me to Albemarle, took me to South Carolina, took me to Monroe, took me to Rockingham. Took me all over the place. Everywhere he went, he took me. 3 weeks, the guy said, the 4th week, he said, pass your papers up. I want to see your papers, see how many signatures you got. He looked at mine and said, you don't have to go anymore. Well, something y'all had brought me back. In 3 weeks, I saw it. Didn't know what it was, but I saw it. I heard it. You laughed. I heard that. You weren't laughing at me. My perception changed. 3 weeks. I don't care why anybody comes. Sign a paper. Their wife makes them. Court makes them. Doctor makes them. Doesn't matter. If they come, we got to keep them. That's on us. We've got to change their perception. You did it for me. We have to do it for them. That's why we're here. That's why we're here. Primary purpose. That is why we're here. If we can't do that, we don't need to be here. We have to carry the message to the still suffering alcoholic. You carried it to me. I have to carry it. You have to carry it. If we can't do that, we don't need to be here. Whatever it takes, that's what we have to do. On Wednesday nights, I drive 90 miles to get back to the prison. I could stay there in Fayetteville and stay in a motel. Just as easy. My cousin would pay for me to stay there just as easy. But I'll drive home on Wednesday nights so I can try to make that prison meeting. I don't always get home in time to do that. But I try. We've got to make the effort. It's up to us. Thank you.